Now I'd like to take a moment to see how file permissions will affect some of the assignments you'll be working on in weeks 3, 4, and 5. Now, this is an area that I get probably more questions than anything about. And usually the questions involve permissions, someone trying to create a script or a file and getting an error message. And most of the time those kind of questions can be resolved by knowing what user you're signed in as, what directory that you're currently located in, and what the active permissions are on that directory. So with that, I have signed into the Nuke distribution here under the default account Nuke. Now in some of the later assignments you will actually be creating your own user, and you may have already done that just working around in the Unix environment, and that's certainly fine. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change to my own personal account here, and I'm using the SU command. The SU command is switch user, and what I want to do is I want to switch to the Scott account, because remember the Nuke account is not root, but it's sort of privileged, and I want to show you kind of what you might run into as a non-privileged user. So I certainly would invite you to create your own account using either the add user or user add commands and experimenting with this a little bit. But back to the SU command. This allows me to change from one account that I'm currently logged into to another. Enter SU space Scott or SU space in your user account without the dash. What the dash does is it tells it to perform any processing that's configured in your startup scripts. And I believe there's some documentation inside of the readings in weeks 1 and 2 where it talks about login scripts. These are basically scripts that are executed when you first log in. They set up your environment, set up variables and whatnot. If you omit the dash in the SU command, it doesn't execute those scripts, and you might end up with an environment that's not quite configured like you expect. If you use the dash, it tells it the SU command to go ahead and process all of the scripts as if you were doing a normal login instead of a switch user operation. Now with the SU, I'm still prompted for the password, so that it's not any kind of magic way into other people's accounts. You can SU to the root account, but there again you still have to have the password. And I'm going to go ahead and enter my password here. And now as we can see, I am the Scott user. Now if I use the who command, notice that I don't see the Scott user anywhere. It's logged in. Remember, the who command shows who's logged into the server, because who only shows, at least in this particular Unix distribution, who is logged in directly. In other words, I directly logged in as Nuke and then did an SU to Scott, so it doesn't pick up the fact that Scott is logged in, only that Nuke was originally logged in. By the same token, if I use the who am I command, which is a variation of who, and this is not supported on all Unixes, but you can certainly try this and see if it's supported by your instance, it reports that I am the Nuke user. Again, because I originally signed on as Nuke and then switched to Scott. However, if I do the echo command and echo the user variable, remember this is a variable that's automatically established for you, it does report the user that I'm currently active in. So if you're running Knoppix or really any Unix or Linux distribution and you want to know for sure who you're logged in as and the prompt doesn't tell you, you can always do an echo user, and that should give you pretty much accurate information. I say pretty much because all Unixes are different. Or you can use the who am I command, and that should provide accurate information as well, unless you've performed a switch user operation. Now with that, I've signed on as the Scott user, and I'm going to use the pwd command to see what directory I'm in, and we can see that I've been placed into my own home directory. So from this we would assume that I could create files, edit files, and do basically anything I need to in this home directory. Now remember, when you create your own user or create other accounts, that it is entirely possible, in fact it is very easy, to create a home directory that your user can switch to or can occupy, but then has no permissions to create files for. You have to make sure that the home directory you've created is owned by the user you intended. For instance, home Scott should be owned by the Scott user, and that you've given the owner sufficient permissions to read, write, and execute files. If you don't, then you will find you have a home directory that you can't really use for anything. And I have seen that happen numerous times. So the first thing we want to find out is we know that we're the Scott user, we know we're in home Scott. Now we want to find out what permissions are on this directory. So we can use the LSL. Remember, this is the long format of the directory list, and it also provides information about permissions on the files. And remember, a directory is nothing more than a file that happens to be a container for other files. So just like everything in Unix we say is a file, directories are files as well. I'm going to use the D option on the ls command. What this tells Unix to do is to give me the information about home Scott, the directory, but don't list all of the files that are within home Scott. For instance, if I do an lsl home Scott, it gives me a directory list of the files within home Scott. That's not really what I care about at this point. What I want to know is what are the permissions on home Scott itself. So I do an ls -ld, D meaning directory information, and then do a home Scott, and it actually gives me only the information about the home Scott directory, which is what I want. Now you can see that the owner of this directory is Scott, so we have got the first setting correct. The group happens to be admin because this is the default user or default group for the Scott user. That might be any group depending on how you've configured your user. It might be the admin group, it could be the users group, whatever group you set as your default when you create your user. And if you notice, the owner, Scott, has read, write, and execute permissions for this directory. So that means that I can write files to this directory, read files to this directory, write files to this directory, and I can cd or change to this directory. If I am not Scott but a member of the admin group, I can only read files, basically get a directory listing of this directory, and I can change to this directory, but I can't write anything in this directory. The same for world, only has read and execute permissions. So if I want to create a file, one of the easiest ways to validate that you can actually create files and you have sufficient permissions is use the touch command. The touch command creates a file, whatever you happen to give as a name. It just creates a 0 byte, an empty file, and if the touch command works, then you should have rights to be able to create any files in the directory you need to. So I'm just going to create one called test. And if I do an ls-l and look in this directory, you'll notice that there is a file out here called test, 0 bytes, has nothing in it, and it has read, write, read permissions. And we'll talk a little bit later why those permissions happen to be set. But the main thing I want you to get here is that we were able to create a file. By the same token, if I vi a file called test2, I'll go into insert mode. This is a test file. And then we're going to do the WQ to save it. Notice it takes me back out to a prompt. And I have a file here called test2. If you're in VI and you happen to be in a directory where you do not have sufficient permissions, you're going to see something different. Here I have changed, if you notice, to the root directory. This is the top level directory in the file system. Now, most non-privileged users, in fact I can't think of any reason why any non-privileged user would have rights to this directory other than maybe to list files, maybe to change the directory, but I certainly wouldn't have rights to create files in this directory under normal circumstances. Again, it depends on how you've configured your system. But if I were to VI a file called test, I want to create a file called test in the root directory, and I create my file again. Now I'm going to save it using the WQ. Notice what happens. I get an error called E212 can't open file for writing. Now, depending on what flavor of VI or Vim you have, you may see a different message here, but the meaning will be the same. VI is telling me it can't write this file because I don't have file rights in this directory to create files.